Hello and welcome to our Conversations with Academy Award-nominated artists. We're coming to you from the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, California today. I'm Glenn Kaiser. I'm the director of the Dolby Institute, and this podcast is a collaboration of the Dolby Institute and the Soundworks Collection. I'm thrilled to be here talking about A Quiet Place with a couple guys that I've known for a long time, Ethan Van Der Rijn, Erik Aadahl. Welcome to our humble little podcast here.
Thanks so much, Glenn. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Appreciate you guys making the time. So, you know, I went back and I watched and listened to the film again before coming over and talking to you guys. And I did a little research. I went in and watched a couple of interviews that because you guys have been doing a lot of press on this film for a while.
I've done a couple.
I listened to a couple of interviews that you guys have done and read a couple of interviews, and it was so painful. Like I was stunned. A couple people have actually asked you guys. So this is basically a silent movie. So did that make your jobs as sound editors easier?
Yeah. No, we actually have had that question.
And I'm like, oh my God, these people have no idea. So look, so the Dolby Institute and Soundworks Collection podcast. There's a lot of students, but a lot of film professionals. So we have a pretty informed audience. So hopefully, we'll have a little bit more in-depth conversation.
Great.
Than that.
Much appreciated.
I did want to. There's so much that I want to ask you guys about this film because as I was chatting with Erik before we started, obviously sound is important to every movie, and we all preach the gospel about why sound is important and that it's a critical element of the storytelling. But this particular film, I mean, more so than pretty much any movie I think in recent memory, it's just part of the storytelling. It's an integral part of the story. And I know that you guys got involved with the movie and got hired by John before he actually went and shot. So can you tell a little bit about how the project came to you and what were those conversations that you had with John Krasinski, who obviously was the co-writer and director and the star, before he went off and shot the movie?
Mm-hmm. Well, we got a phone call from one of the producers, Andrew Form, who we'd worked with before.
Andrew, he's from Platinum Dunes, so you guys
Platinum
have done
Dunes,
the Transformers movies.
Yeah, and it was
right?
I think Michael Bay who really introduced us years ago. And Andrew told Ethan and I, well, I've got this script, and it's all about sound. I know you hear that all the time.
Yeah.
The producer's trying to get you to do the movie, but this time it's true. And we're like, well, maybe we'll
sure.
Let's
send it over.
Send it over.
It. Yeah.
We'll have a read and see if that's true. And Ethan and I read the script, and we're just blown away by how sound was baked into the script. Sound was a central character, and we had this conversation right after reading, and we're like, this is a dream.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, we met with Andrew and his producing partner, Brad Fuller, and they introduced us to John Krasinski, who was at the time working on his draft of the script. And
so this was an existing script that he had kind of come on.
Yeah, the script. It was a script written by Beck and Woods that came across the desk of Platinum Dunes, and they snatched it up. They were excited about the whole concept. So, and then John came in because at the time he was working with the same producers on the Jack Ryan series. And they thought, would you be interested in acting in this? And John's kind of chewed on it for a while and said, well, if I can rewrite it and direct it, yes, I'll act in it. So
that's how they got him.
So anyways, before he was still working on the script, and it was before they had hired a picture editor, before they had hired a music composer, that John met with us. And before we could say anything, John was like, this is a sound designer's dream.
Yeah.
We're like, oh my gosh, I think he gets it.
Yeah.
It was pretty thrilling. And right from the very beginning, we just started talking scenes and concepts. And one of the things that really stood out to us in the script was the character Regan, the daughter.
Because she's deaf.
Because
she's cochlear implants,
she's
right?
deaf, and just imagine being in that situation in a world where sound and understanding sound is so critical, and this character, being so vulnerable, but also a very strong character. She teaches her family sign language,
right,
which is one of their survival tricks. So we were just thrilled about all these ideas, and soon learned that for John, it was non-negotiable to cast an actual deaf actress, Millicent Simmons, to play Regan.
Who's fantastic in this.
Who is amazing. She was kind of the guiding light of this whole film, and in fact informed us, what does it sound like to have a cochlear implant?
Really?
In. Huh. So just from the ground up, this film was just immersed in sound, and all through production, John was thinking about sound. In fact, he enforced a silence policy on set.
Really?
Sets are normally really
very
loud.
Noisy places, yeah.
Yeah, walkies going, art department's banging, doing stuff. He had everybody be quiet. And Millie actually taught the cast how to use sign language.
Really?
So it just became part of the entire film, the idea of sound.
Yeah.
It wasn't an afterthought.
Well, and quiet. And that's the thing that I think obviously we have an informed audience, but I would say to people who don't know, this is not an almost silent film. There's an unbelievable amount of incredibly detailed work that goes into this film. I mean, one of the things I really like talking with artists about, and writers and directors and sound artists, is the first 10 minutes of the movie, which is kind of a critical, that you have so much responsibility in that first 10 minutes to kind of explain the rules of the world to the audience, and to set the cinematic language that you're going to use for your storytelling. And it's interesting because when I was watching the film again, you've got that whole kind of pre-credit sequence before the title of the movie comes up, with when they're in the I guess the abandoned store and kind of getting the medicine, and then of course the whole first attack with the kid, and that is almost exactly 10 minutes. So I would love for you guys just to spend a couple of minutes talking to us about that first 10 minutes, because everything that you had to establish is in there. You guys have you do the POV of Regan with her cochlear implants in that, and you establish everything. It's just a fantastically constructed sequence for sound. So dive in.
Yeah. So that's actually one of the first scenes that we tackled. There was really two scenes that we started on, and they were the sort of priority for John. And one of them was this. There's a scene about midway through the film that takes place in the cornfield, where Millie's character is alone, and there's one of the alien creatures emerges out of the cornfield behind her.
But she can't hear it, obviously.
She can't hear it, and it can't see her because it's blind, even though it's 10 feet from her.
Yeah.
And then her cochlear implant starts to interfere with some kind of electrical field that the alien has.
Right.
And so we start to set up this whole sort of key plot point about the interference of her cochlear implant
when they're close by
with the alien. And that was a sort of important nut to crack, because obviously it's a key plot point for the film, and we really had to tell that story with sound.
Yeah.
And so that was important for us to figure out, okay, how is this going to work? And then the other really important scene to figure out, as you've mentioned, was the opening scene. And so there it was really about, okay, how quiet can we make this world? And how do we sort of establish the idea that everything that makes too much of a sound that stands out from its background is already gone, has already been killed.
Because you kind of have a world where people are already gone. So what is, exactly. What does a world without people sound like, right?
And, one of the really interesting things about this movie is we're thrust right into the middle of this world.
Without any explanation.
There's no explanation. There's no backstory. There's no montage of, this invasion and explaining, this situation.
Which I love about it.
We're just thrown right into the middle of it. And so really we have to start right from the beginning explaining or helping to explain with sound what's going on.
Right.
And so it was about how quiet can we make it, and how do we start establishing relationships between different levels of sound. And the idea of sonic masking, how that characters can only make as much sound as whatever ambient sound is behind them allows them to stay safe.
Right.
So
when they're at the waterfall, they can make a lot of sound, but if they're out in the open, they have to be really, really quiet.
Exactly. And so in those first 10 minutes, we're really trying to set up some of these ground rules,
right,
that are going to sort of continue to take place for the next 2 hours or hour and a half, really. And then, of course, the alien creature gets introduced at the end of the sequence.
At the tail end of that sequence,
At the tail end of the sequence. And that obviously is like, oh my God, this is like a crazy, dangerous situation these people are in. But
that was really brilliant, because how many movies kill a child in the first 10 minutes of the film? But it really just made you feel for like, okay, the stakes on this are really high.
The stakes don't get any higher. And so from that point on, you realize these people are literally fighting for their lives moment to moment.
And I remember it's just so, because the movie did such a good job of explaining those stakes. Like there's a sequence shortly after that where the kids are playing the board game, and Regan knocks over the lamp, and it creates this loud crash. And I remember being in the audience, and people just gasped when that lamp knocks over and crashes, because you know what that means, know. And it's so it's the thing that I found fascinating about it. Seeing that movie with an audience in a movie theater, with it being so quiet, you actually became more aware of the people around you, and it became like you could feel people holding their breath. It actually, the quietness of it made the audience more engaged.
That's one of the things that I think, a lot of filmmakers, and this is something we've been fighting against for a while, a lot of filmmakers, and I think audiences too, assume that if you have a lot of sound, if you've got, bombastic music and, tons of sound going on, it actually is engaging.
Right.
And in a weird way, it can actually do the inverse over time. It can push an audience away and kind of
and your ears close
make
up.
You zone out, and your ears close up, and you get kind of tired. But when you strip things away, when you start to find the negative space, you can start to pull the audience in and open up the ears and have people just hang on to every little moment and every little detail and really start to engage with the scenes. And that's what was one of the most wonderful things about A Quiet Place, was we were given the license through the very story to make people lean in. And what was kind of incredible too is that and we got all this feedback after the film came out that people were afraid to like breathe, and that they were holding their breaths and they're hanging on to every moment, and they're afraid to eat popcorn. And somebody else,
I noticed that too when I was sitting there, like people stopped eating because it was sort of like they didn't want to make any sound to like give the characters in the film away.
They'll become the hunted from other audience members if they make that sound, and in a funny way that makes the audience an active participant in what's actually happening on screen. And so it's thrilling to have that interactivity with an audience. And you mentioned the Monopoly scene. A few people told us, oh my gosh, that lantern getting knocked over is one of the loudest sounds I've ever heard in a film. And it's not at all.
But it's about contrast.
But because it comes out of this stretch of quiet, we've kind of now we're putting the audience into kind of a trance and creating a false sense of safety. And so when that comes, it's that dynamic range, it's that contrast that makes it feel so jarring.
I'm kind of curious about was there experimentation? Did you guys go too far? Did you make it too quiet? How did you figure out?
Well, there was definitely a lot of experimentation. It was interesting. It was an interesting process in the sense that with most films that we do, we'll do a certain number of test screenings.
So you do a tip mix for a test screening
with an audience, and get reaction, so we can gauge how certain aspects are working. And with this film, because of the fact the key visual effects of the aliens weren't done until very, very late in the process, we really weren't able to screen the movie in front of a test audience. It was tried once, and people actually started laughing at a key moment with the alien because it was actually John playing the alien dressed up in a green leotard.
Right. Yeah.
And so obviously that wasn't the reaction.
Breaks the spell.
So it was interesting because we couldn't screen the movie to gauge how well it was working for people who hadn't seen the movie. Mm-hmm. Really, in all of our work, we're always sort of basing what we do on our own gut reactions, and Erik and I are always bouncing ideas off of each other. And we were saying, well, we think this is really working. This feels engaging. We're in the story. We're in the characters' heads, and we're in it. But are other people going to be able to stick with this? Because we did start to experiment with, when we go into Millie's head, we go into her, what John came to call her sonic envelope. Mm-hmm. And we have a sound for when we're in her head, in her sonic envelope, and she has her cochlear implant turned on.
Right. And which is not silent.
It's not silent, but it's very quiet. It's kind of a low rumble.
Right. There's a lot of low frequency in it, but no articulation and sort of like no high end, right? So it's sort of like
Yeah.
Right.
And more of a feeling
Right.
than a hearing, which is how she described it. Yeah.
Oh, so she actually told you guys.
Well, her mom, who acts as her translator out in the world, described to John when they were shooting the movie how she described her experience, and then John, in turn, described her, that to us. And so that's what we used. We used her actual experience to base the sound design on. And for us, we kind of compared it to experiences that we've both had in anechoic chambers, where, which are completely quiet environments, where what happens is after maybe 5-10 minutes, your ears start to open up to the point where what you hear is the sound of your own body internally.
Right.
You start to hear your blood pumping, and you start to hear your nervous system. And so that's sort of what we used to base that part of the sound design on. And then there are 3 moments in the film where we're in that sonic envelope, and then she turns off the cochlear implant. Mm-hmm. And that's when we take out all the sound. Right. We go completely silent. And we did experiment a lot with, first of all, where do we go in and out of her sonic envelope? And
I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the transitions, because you established that in that first 10 minutes, but those transitions happen really fast, and you're in and out of her experience. But because you established that convention in the first 10 minutes, the audience is ready for it when it happens.
Yeah,
exactly. And we needed to establish it in a scene where there was no music going,
right,
where you can hear that shift very clearly. There was some experimentation, what if we ease into it? But we really fought for, let's do it right on the cut to her,
hard cut,
boom,
right,
into her. So it's super, super clear.
That it's her perspective. That you're now in her perspective.
We're now in her shoes. Yeah.
It was interesting because we mentioned, the first 2 scenes that we started with were the opening 10 minutes and the scene in the cornfield. And it was this scene in the cornfield where we first experimented with going straight into her sonic envelope. So we're really hearing what she hears. And we did that because it was so important to tell the story of what's going on with the interference between her cochlear implant and the biology of this alien creature. And we're like, oh, this is going to be cool. This is going to be cool. Yeah. But we need to set it up early in the movie.
We can't do it there for the first time.
So then when we went back and started working on the first 10 minutes, we looked for the first place where can we set this up?
Oh, so that actually wasn't part of the original design of that first 10 minutes, was her audio POV.
No.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So that came out of the editorial process for you guys.
Very much so. And
Very cool.
It was an interesting process. There were a lot of things that came out of the editorial process. Another thing we realized early on when we first started working on that scene in the cornfield was, so we go into her point of view, and then we also go into the sonic point of view of the creature. Because these creatures have hypersensitive hearing, and we wanted to get that point across. And so there's a point where the ear opens up, sort of fillets open, and we zoom in, and we do the same thing with the sound, where we morph out of the ambient sounds of the cornfield and into the sort of hyper real perception, that sonic perception that the creature has. And we realized, we need more time to make this transition happen and to make it clear. And John was amazing, because he's like, oh yeah, I get what you're saying. He got ILM on the phone immediately.
I need more visual effects.
We need to extend this shot, slow it down, and give more time to really make this happen.
And you guys use that effect a couple of times. I'm thinking also about the sequence in the basement with Evelyn. Evelyn, when she's at that just extraordinary sequence where she's having her contractions and the creature's down there, and she sets the kitchen timer, right? Yeah. And it's just such a beautifully constructed sequence.
The whole egg timer, that's her sonic diversion,
right?
And she, the family has obviously pre-planned a lot of this, and she's searching for where's the egg timer as she's going through labor. And and we established the ticking, the very quiet ticking of the egg timer going, and now it's the old Hitchcock ticking clock, the ticking bomb. And the creature comes down. It's using its echolocation to try searching for her. And its ears then fillet open, similarly to the cornfield. And then we hear its hyper-acute perception of the egg timer, which fills every speaker, and it's, giant. And in the film, we then cut back to the egg timer, nice and quiet again.
Yeah, exactly.
For that contrast just before it rings. And originally, the scene wasn't really constructed that way. It was, once we started playing with the sound, Chris Tellefson, who's a picture editor working in New York, incredibly collaborative, sharp guy. Once he got the sound, that's when we started reorganizing it.
You guys are making my heart sing, like making the visual effects and the picture editorial change to the sound. Oh,
that's how it should be. That's the alchemy of
That's right.
sound.
Yeah. And this really was a movie where, sound in many ways is the engine sort of driving the narrative forward. So it really needed to work. There were certain aspects of the film visually and pictorially that really couldn't be figured out until we had started on the sound design and really started to find out what do we need the picture to be doing.
Yeah. So I know you guys both primarily as sound designers and effects guys. So how do you work together? How do you divide up? What's your approach?
Well, basically, it's a very kind of how do you describe it? Collaborative.
It's very collaborative.
I think we're kind of our own hardest audiences.
Do you guys push each other?
We push each other harder than I think any director has ever put. We're very hard to impress. Let's put it that way. So if Ethan can impress me with an idea, like I love that. And
vice versa.
And the inverse too. If I can impress Ethan with something, we like to surprise ourselves, and somehow like the alchemy between the two of us. I think we push each other harder than anyone else.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think about, my career before Erik and I teamed up. Really, the main sort of driver in my own work was, how do I surprise myself? Mm-hmm. Like, that was what it was all about. I want to surprise myself every day. If I can surprise myself
just
once a day and like take my breath away, it's like, that's a good day.
Yeah.
And the really cool thing I found about working with Erik is he's the exact same way.
Right.
So now I have like a partner to like, not only do I want to surprise myself, but I want to surprise him.
Sure.
And vice versa. So in a way, it makes it like more than twice as good. It's like squared good.
That's awesome. But on a practical basis, do you guys divvy up scenes, or are you both working on the same thing?
Oftentimes, when we split up, we might be working with different editors and dealing with all the different parts of our departments. When we're together, we'll dig into a scene, and that's so it's kind of like this. Exhale, inhale kind of process. Go out, work with the team, come together now and focus together.
Yeah.
And to me, it's one of the most exciting times when we do come together. I'm like, oh, I got something.
Actually, A Quiet Place was a good example of that because it was sort of a condensed schedule. When we first started it, there was a lot of pressure to figure out some of the conceptual ideas quickly and really like get on track quickly.
Because there's a lot of pressure. Is this going to work? Right.
Is this going to work, and what is this going to be, and how is this going to work? Because there wasn't a blueprint. It was like us sitting down together and like figuring it out.
Yeah.
And so it was a really great example of how like working together we can really dig in deep and just quickly sort of work through ideas and throw out ideas and get to what's working really quickly.
Did you guys ever? Was there anything like did you ever get pushback from the studio? Like it's too quiet. Like you guys have gone too far.
What we were just talking about that. One of the benefits of working on a smaller film that might be kind of under the radar.
Nobody was paying attention to it.
It's not a $200 million budget. Yeah. The stakes aren't like as high. I think in a way that wound up working really well for the film on a creative level. We could take these kind of unheard of risks, and look, the script itself, there's almost no dialogue in it.
Right.
Like what $100 million movie would have almost no dialogue?
Sure.
Like it's impossible. Would never happen. So, just from the ground up, there were all these kind of like experimental risks that we could take.
Yeah.
And the studio was supportive. Like they kind of were letting, the producers and John kind of run with it.
Yeah.
But all of us were kind of like, is this, like Ethan mentioned, is this going to work? How are people going to respond? And the first screening of the film was at South by Southwest.
Right.
And
That's right.
We were still mixing, and we just like, okay, here's where we're at. We'll send it over. And John flew out to Austin for it.
And it went through the roof.
And it was like standing ovation. Yeah. And after that, Jim Giannopoulos from Paramount, everyone's like,
you guys know what you're doing.
Don't break
you're
it.
Good.
Don't break it.
Yeah. That's great. I have so many more questions for you guys. Is there a movie where the Foley was more important? Give a shout out to your Foley team on this.
So we used Foley 1 and
Steve Bain and Peter Purcell.
Yeah,
up in Canada, and they did just an amazing job. Like you said, the Foley in this movie is so.
Because how many movies do you actually hear the Foley so clearly? Right?
Close up, foot on sand, all the compaction, and what was wonderful too for Foley to shine in this film was it could shine because it wasn't competing with the time. Every sound we put in the film was very specific.
Right.
And so the little sounds became big sounds, which was exquisite.
Little sounds becoming big sounds. I would love for you guys to talk just a little bit about the vocalizations of the main actors, because obviously they're expending a lot of energy not to make sounds, but they do. They're breathing. They're vocal. So did they come back and do ADR sessions? What were the production tracks that came to you guys? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we did bring them back to do that. It was interesting because the first cut of the movie that Erik and I watched, it was very rough, but one of the things we both of us really keyed in on is, even though these characters aren't really speaking, we really want to
sign language.
Yeah. We really want to be able to hear them. They're breathing,
right.
And when they are just mouthing words, just the faintest sort of whisper to help connect us with them. Because, this is such an intimate movie. it was really important to figure out ways to get close to the characters, and that was obviously an important tool to make that happen. So we did, start with the production tracks, but then there's obviously areas in the movie where we wanted a little more, a little more whisper, and so we did bring the actors back and shot ADR with them. And
those must have been interesting and fun ADR sessions.
The whisper pass.
The whisper pass, yeah.
But we got to say,
breathing, right?
And breathing, and just all, like Ethan said, all of those intimate things that just pull you in, and because at its core, this is a film about 4 characters that are a family that we want to fall in love with, and we want the audience to feel intimate with. So those little delicate breaths and whispers are pretty critical for that. And we should say that Michael Borovsky, the production mixer, did some extraordinary recording on set. It's usually impossible to capture detailed, tiny little whispers and breaths, but he caught a ton.
And no matter how great he might be, he's not gonna. Your production tracks are not going to be as quiet as what you ultimately needed the film to be, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so exactly. So it was Bob Jackson supervised all of those ADR sessions to capture all of that. And I think that was it was during those ADR sessions that Millie, our deaf actress playing Regan, it was the first time her mom had seen any of the film, and they put our rough stereo crash down of our sound work up on the ADR stage while they play the scene. And John, Ethan and I were not there, but Bob and John Krasinski were, and John told us later that Millie's mom broke out crying.
Really?
She told John, "Thank you for letting me experience what my daughter experiences."
Oh my gosh!
We played through a sequence of her POVs.
Ugh.
Yeah, in fact, one of
that's the greatest compliment
of course
I could imagine.
I think one of the most moving compliments that we've gotten on our work in this film was from Millie herself. We met her for the first time a few weeks ago at a Q&A, and she said to us, for the first time in my life, I feel like my experience of the world, people understand. And it was just like, it brought both of us to tears because it was like so genuine, and it was pretty special.
We don't get a lot of moments like that in our part of the business, do we?
No.
but the thing is, with sound, it's we should.
It's an emotional thing
because sound is such an emotional sense, and it, evolutionarily speaking, it predates our ability to see. It's so deep within us, and the reptilian part of the brain, fight or flight, but also comfort, and sound is it's invisible because it is so close to us. It's kind of like the finger can't point to itself. But it's because of that sound is such a powerful tool in cinema. And we try to approach every project, but especially A Quiet Place, as sound is half of the experience, if not more.
Well, especially on this film, I would argue even more. Tell me a little bit about the sound design for the creatures. We talked a little bit about it.
Those were recorded on set.
That was all live, right? But you talked a little bit about they would flay and open up, and then the hearing stuff. But and you talked about echolocation, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. They're pinging and kind of knocking, and what was the process of building their kind of palette?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, it was a very experimental process. The thing with creature design is you can never just think of them as creatures.
Right.
You have to think of them as living, breathing animals that have behavior and different ranges of behavior. And, you almost have to think of it almost like a nature documentary. Like, okay, let's reverse construct what this is. We're not just going to try to make them scary. Like, they need to have a soul.
Yeah.
We need to kind of dig into what their behavior is. So talking with John Krasinski about it, he kind of described a number of different modes that these creatures have, and which is a spectrum of intensity. There's kind of like an idling mode, which is where they're just moving through the world, breathing and purring. there's kind of a searching mode, which is where they're using echolocation. Because they're essentially blind, they use their hyper-acute hearing through echolocation to paint a sonic map of their geography, the same way a bat would, or a dolphin using sonar, or whales. So that's kind of like their searching and viewing mode. And then, of course, they have their more agitated, intense modes where they're either in pain or they're aggressive or in attack mode. So we had to kind of create palettes for all of these different modes. And one of the first things we started working on was the echolocation mode, because to us that was one of the most interesting things, and also had the potential of creating the most tension in some of these quiet scenes. Like you mentioned the birthing scene where Emily's going through labor down in the basement and a creature is searching her out. So we started just with the literal, like, okay, what if we take dolphin clicks and try to use those for echolocation? And we tried dolphins, bats, beluga whales. Everything felt a little bit too relatable in a way. There was something
not quite scary enough.
We wanted something a little more
just to amp it up
alien,
a bit. Right.
Something we hadn't really heard before, because these are such weird, terrifying creatures. And it was actually one of our sound designers, Brandon Jones, who stumbled upon a prop that we have here in the shop. It's a stun gun. And we've recorded it a bunch of times for different movies and wound up re-recording
and those
it
have
for this one.
that have that very specific kind of click.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They have a kind of clicking sound which can turn into a buzz or a purr when you start conducting it against something.
Right.
And we wound up using grapes because they're a lot like skin. There's the kind of little fleshy skin on it, and then this wet interior that conducts the electricity. So we could kind of work the stun gun like an instrument and kind of do a vocal performance with it. And then slow it down to get a little bit more richness in all of the clicks, and then add reflections around it. And that became kind of the center of its echolocation sound.
Yeah.
And then just, one interesting part to add about the whole sound design process of these alien creatures was some of our early passes. Most of their sounds take place off screen in the movie, and some of our early passes we had a lot more of their sounds, their echolocation, their vocalization, all of it. And we realized at a certain point, we just need to strip it back. And we started pulling layers off the screen, pulling it out, and suddenly it started to gel and became much scarier. And it was a great sort of, relearning the idea that sometimes less is more. And that was definitely the case.
The old Jaws effect,
Well, and you guys, like this movie, I feel like I could teach we could all teach a masterclass in that concept using this movie. Like you were talking about, the few times when Regan turns off her cochlear implant, like some of the most terrifying stuff in the film is when she does that and the sound drops out, but you still see all this frenetic activity of the attack on the screen.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
That's actually
because of the lack of sound, right?
Yeah.
It's like pulling a rug out from under the audience. You have nothing supporting you. So in a weird way, there's this dichotomy. This it's kind of like how. For me, how like Scorsese uses happy music in a scene where something horrific is happening.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this weird counterpoint. My favorite moment of the film is towards the end of the film where Regan turns off her cochlear implant because the feedback with the proximity of these aliens is painful. She turns it off, and she's in the back of this truck with her brother.
Right.
And he looks over her shoulder and sees something,
and his
face just blossoms into the incredible performance, just pure terror. And Regan doesn't see what he's seeing.
Right.
She's just seeing his reaction to it. But in silence, that combination to me we just don't get to do that kind of a thing in movies.
That's perfect.
And this one just gave.
It's perfect for you that
us.
one of your favorite moments is one of the moments when the sound completely goes on.
Yeah, because it's novel. It's very different. And, That was one of the gifts.
Well, I feel that we should probably give a little acknowledgement to Brandon Proctor as well for the mix on this film is just amazing.
And honestly, it wasn't just the mix because he came down very early. We were actually supposed to start the effects pre-dubs, and so he came down to do that with us. And we realized, what we really need to be doing instead of pre-dubbing the effects is we need to be like temp mixing the whole movie.
Just mix the movie, right?
We just need to start mixing the movie. So we actually started doing that. And it was in that process that, for instance, what I was just mentioning about the creature design being, there being too much sound for them. We realized that with Brandon, and he was, a big part of helping to clean that out and strip that back. So, it wasn't strictly mixing. He actually was helping, create the design. So it was a very collaborative, effort in that sense. So yeah, Brandon was huge in terms of shaping the whole track.
You were talking about the this concept that they can only make as much sound as the environment that they're in, so that they have to stay under that to stay safe. So you got that beautiful sequence between John Krasinski and his son when they're at the waterfall and they can finally let loose and make sound and actually talk to each other.
Yeah.
And there's that beautiful moment when the son asks him, "Why didn't you let Regan come in?" It's just that it's. I think by the point the audience gets there, they're so ready to I need to have some kind of catharsis here, and the sequence is just perfectly constructed for that. But talk a little bit about it sonically and how that whole, because of course we were talking about the not to cross-talk movies that are nominated, but we were having this conversation with the Black Panther guys yesterday. A waterfall is just nothing but a white noise generator. So how do you engage that with that and make it interesting?
Yeah. Well, it's like you mentioned, it's interesting on a number of levels when this scene hits. It's interesting on an emotional level. We've been challenging the audience for quite a stretch now with no dialogue.
Right.
And this is the first scene where people actually talk. So there is something just like a release about that. We have also come out of a stretch of silence, culminating with the setup of the nail on the steps.
When she steps on the nail, yeah.
And, well, this is before she steps on it.
Oh, right, but you set it up,
This
right?
is when the laundry
bag
bag kind of pulls it up, so now it's in a much more dangerous position. And we do that just with the simple sound of burlap bag and the nail little creak, and then silence. And then, boom, we go to the waterfall.
Right.
And it was funny, we got, right after the movie came out, we did a lecture at USC for Leonard Maltin's class, and he said, "That waterfall is the loudest waterfall I've heard in any movie." And again, no, it's not.
It's just because of the contrast.
But because it's coming out of this very quiet scene, it's the contrast, the dynamics that makes it feel so powerful. So in that way, it's kind of a catharsis for the audience too. Okay, now we can. It's safe to eat popcorn now, right? I can breathe a little bit, and but it works perfectly into the logic of the film, which basically we're kind of describing the physics of sound here, the concept of sonic masking. A loud sound will mask a quieter sound.
Well, because John Krasinski actually explains it to his son while they're there, because the son's still terrified, right? And John has to explain to him, no, we're safe because it's so loud here.
And that sets up the way the family saves the mother in the birth scene.
Right.
Through
by creating
a bigger sound that will mask her sound. So,
this was really intricately constructed for all these rules, right? It's fascinating.
And I just love that scene where we're cutting in and out and you hear different perspectives within it, and then we cut back out and the kid screams, which should be the loudest sound in the scene, but because we're back and behind the waterfall, you barely hear it. But Brandon Proctor just got it right.
But you do hear it, and it's actually really emotional because the kid is just having this huge cathartic moment, and you can barely hear it cut through the sound of the waterfall. It's really just an elegant beautiful sequence.
Yeah, well, it's kudos to Brandon Proctor for finding all of those delicate balances. That was also a tricky scene because you're shooting next to a waterfall.
Sure.
So there's some of the production is like, I don't know how Michael Borovsky got some of those lines in there. We didn't need to use ADR, but then one word we'd pop into ADR just for clarity, and then pop back. And Brandon matched it all gorgeously.
Man, what a nightmare.
You'd never know.
Wow. I would have just presumed that you guys had to loop those whole sequences. Obviously, setting the world, kind of making this space for these characters to live in. Can you talk to us a little bit about Dolby Atmos and how you guys used it? Like, did you guys know from the beginning that this was going to be an Atmos mix? Were you native Atmos the whole time through? Or
no, we actually weren't native Atmos, and so we did an Atmos pass after the 7.1 mix, and usually we are native, and maybe, it was interesting in the sense like having the first few passes through the film to really be able to think, okay, when we do the Atmos, how are we going to use it? And it's interesting in this film because, in many ways it's such a delicate film. And I think, one of my favorite, and I know Erik's talked about this moment too as one of his favorite Atmos moments, is, such a quiet, delicate moment, which, normally we think of Atmos as like, how do we make this immersive and put sound all around
Fly
us?
Stuff around, right, yeah.
And this is an example of sort of, which really, it's a metaphor for how sound is used in the whole film, which is like, how can we use subtlety and delicacy and quiet to really engage the audience and pull the audience into the story and make them part of it. And so there's a moment in the film where Emily is setting up, the nursery for her unborn child, and she's hanging a mobile over the crib they've set up in this safe room. And Brandon Proctor put the slightest bit of movement from this mobile, which of course has to be made from little padded animals,
like felt animals, so that it doesn't make sound,
so that it doesn't make sound. But he was able to put just the subtlest sort of movement sounds from these felt animals up in the overhead speakers in the ceiling, so you feel like you're there, with her. You're in the scene. And I think it's a really sort of beautiful example of how we can use Atmos in a subtle way to really help immerse the audience into the story.
Yeah, I think like the most obvious cool thing with Atmos is, we can take the creatures' footsteps and breaths and echolocation and track them in a perfect sphere around the room and from overhead to around. And, we've got wonderful long shots which kind of tracks, so you're able to really realistically use Atmos to move these off-screen creature sounds around you. But to me, the coolest stuff is some of those subtle details. In a way, those are the shining moments for me of Atmos, the little details like the crows in their murder overhead and the leaves in wind, and the little subtle details sometimes almost read even more strongly in Atmos. And I encourage people to go check it out in the home Atmos version.
Thank you for the plug. Well, I think, one of the things that people don't necessarily talk much about when they talk about Atmos is the fact that the spec requires full frequency and individually powered speakers throughout the array. And so that lets you put really specific subtle stuff anywhere in the space. And you guys did it just so massively in this film. It was just fantastic.
The only thing that I would add, you touched on it at the beginning of the conversation, just, how, when the movie first came out, many reviews spoke of it as a silent film, really confusing the sparse amount of dialogue in the film with silence. So I find that such an interesting reaction and so sort of telling about how the general public thinks about sound
or just doesn't
in general, or just doesn't understand. But then the other sort of interesting thing that follows that is the reaction that we got from so many people after sitting through the movie, hearing reports of, like, I walked out into the street and suddenly I was hearing all these things that I've never really noticed before, because their ears had opened up and they had sort of engaged in sort of active listening, which I feel like is something that we as sound artists do every day, right? That's what our lives are about, engaged, active listening. And so I feel like in some ways, for the first time in our careers, we've really been able to bring the joy that we have of being able to actively listen to the world around us when we're out recording, or when we're in the studio working with sounds, just intently listen to something very specifically. And I feel like this movie has allowed us to bring that experience to a wider audience and help people to really be able to perceive in a new way. And like, that's one of the most gratifying results of this movie for us.
Big time.
Fantastic. Well, you guys, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today and kind of like unpack some of this work that is so amazing on A Quiet Place. Ethan Van der Rijn, Erik Aadahl, congratulations on your Oscar nomination on this movie. I was so tickled when I read the news that morning that you guys had gotten this nomination, because it's so well deserved for this film. It's such a showcase for sound design. So congratulations and good luck in a few weeks.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
All right, this is Glenn Kaiser signing off from Warner Brothers for the Dolby Institute and the Soundworks Collection.